Before we dive right into the topic we want to talk about, I heard it was not very easy to get where you at the moment, and you even asked your Facebook fans to tell you where to go to either this country or the other country. Was that correct?
Well, it was slightly problematic. 2 days ago, I was sitting at the Milano airport on my way to Tunisia when the message got out that Gaddafi is dead. And of course, the big question was, should I change and go directly to Libya, or should I go to Tunisia? And for me, it was a little bit the question like, do I look backward or do I look forward? I mean, for me, like, Gaddafi basically was finished since he left Tripolis. So politically, the end of Gaddafi is already 2 months ago, while Tunisia is more forward-looking. We have on Sunday, tomorrow, the really first election after the Arab Spring, the first free, fair, and open Arab elections. So I think this was somehow more important than the death of Gaddafi, although many media saw the opposite.
Karim, the topic of today's TEDxVienna discussion is the domino effect. I think you are sitting right in the middle of what we could call a domino effect situation. How many stones have already fallen?
Well, many stones have fallen. Of course, here, like Tunisia being the first one, then in Egypt, and then, of course, Libya. What we have is kind of an Arab world which is divided in 3 parts, basically, right now. We have an Arab world between Tunisia and the Suez Canal, where the new Arab world is created. And the elections tomorrow is one important point in this. We have, of course, another part of the Arab world, like Syria and Yemen, where, of course, the uprising is in full swing. And we have other parts of the Arab world, like Saudi Arabia, where not much has happened yet. So, of course, this in itself has a dynamic in itself, because many interests in the second parts of the Arab world, like in Saudi Arabia, or also in the parts which are still in the uprising, the regimes have no interest whatsoever that this experiment in North Africa is successful.
You focus very much on revolution, but not just the big ones. You will have a big interest in the small grains of the revolution. So the small parts in society that are changed and that can trigger enormous effects. What are those grains? Which grains can be perceived during such revolutions?
Well, see, the interesting thing is not only so much, media tends to look at, for example, Tahrir Square, or at the first Tunisian election. I mean, that's the focus points they have, or the death of Gaddafi. The interesting things are what happens left and right of that. For example, if you look in Egypt, we have a very interesting development where we have changes in the institutions, a kind of cleansing process in the institutions. For example, one nice example, a story I always am telling is there's a state-run hospital in Cairo. And after the fall of Gaddafi, I have a friend of mine who is specialized in international unions law, trade union law, and he got a phone call from one of the doctors of this hospital. The doctor said, you know, the problem we have this director of this state hospital who was, of course, put into this place by the old regime and who is incredibly corrupt, and we want to get rid of him. So this friend of mine is saying, like, okay, if you really want to do this, you have to organize yourself in the hospital. You have to kind of create some kind of a works council, an organization of the employees. But he said, the really important thing is not only you doctors, but you have to deal with the nurses and the administrative staff. So you all together have to organize yourself in order to get rid of this director. And then the doctor said, okay, hung up the phone, and a few days later he called again and said, like, you know, we have a problem. The doctors don't want to work together with the nurses don't want to work together with the administrative staff. So he basically said, well, in this case, nobody can help you. You can just do this yourself. And then a few weeks later, he read in the newspaper that in this hospital, an organization was formed. They went to the Ministry of Health and they said, we want to get rid of this director of this hospital. And the health minister said, okay, of course, no problem. We put another person in his place. And the people from the hospital said, no, we want to have an election for our director in the hospital. So that is, of course, something, when you see, look at like a few minutes ago, there was no organization in this hospital, like what you would have in Europe or maybe the US, people would be organized. And then a few minutes later, they bypassed what we know in Austria. I mean, there is, for example, no elected director of an hospital, of a state hospital in Austria. So this is kind of this is kind of the flowers blooming in the revolutions on the side, left and right.
That sounds very promising, even for the Western world. Also, the Western world is parts of the Western world faces a economic crisis. Is there something we can learn from the Arab world, from those grains you were talking about?
Well, I think there's many things to learn. I mean, one thing to learn is a form of resistance. Right? I mean, basically what the Arab Spring showed is that if you are able to get the critical mass on the streets, and if they're staying on the street, no regime in the world or no government in the world can ignore it. So you can, if you can organize enough people on the street, you can change basically everything. I think this is one of the most important messages. And the other thing is, what we also see now here is the big discussion in the Arab world about accountability. Not only political accountability, something we never had, of course, in the Arab world. I mean, Egypt, for example, was parked in a garage for 30 years, and there was not such a thing as political accountability, but also economic accountability, right? The whole issues of corruption, and this is, of course, issues which economic accountability is an issue. I think the rest of the world can learn from this discussion here, because economic accountability would be also a nice thing to have in Europe, or to have towards the banks or anything. I mean, that's something like there could be an impulse coming from the Arab world towards Europe.
Okay, but how was it, and is it still possible to get this critical mass out on the streets, out on the places, to show their feelings, to show their protest? In the Western world, this critical mass does not show up so much as we were seeing that in the Arab world. What is still missing in the Western part?
Well, to start with, I mean, it's difficult to get a critical mass out in the long run also in the Arab world. I mean, so we got rid of the dictator, but at the end, this is the starting point of a process, not the end of a process. I mean, the big question is, how will it continue here? And somebody gave me a nice example. He said, he compared it to a football match. He said, you know, we had this match, this football match, and we scored a decisive goal in the second minute. This was when we got rid of Mubarak, when we got rid of Ben Ali, and everyone was celebrating. And we forgot that there's still 88 minutes ahead of us. And I think that's exactly what we have right now. We have 88 minutes ahead of us. And this fight in the Arab world is far from being over. I mean, we still have an issue of interests within the countries which want to stay, which want as much as possible the old way, which don't want to change. And we have like others who want to change. So we're in the middle of this process, and this here is far from over. So I don't know how you can say how much you can learn in Europe. The Arabs are still very busy with themselves right now.
It is, though, fascinating that there are people, many people in the Arab world, who know that they can lose everything, even their lives, for going out on the streets, for protesting. You got to know many of them. What do people think? Why do they do that? Why are they? How can they evolve such braveness?
You see, one of the interesting things when I toured Europe in the last weeks, the question came always up saying, are the Arabs ready for democracy? Do they have the mentality to have a democracy? So my answer always is like, you know, I don't think that 840 people died in Egypt or thousands of people died in Libya in order not to have, I mean, to question their credibility to have a democracy. I think it's just, I don't know, if 840 people died, they have the credibility. They died for something which in Europe is just normal. That is like exactly what happens in Tunisia tomorrow, that people can go to free, fair, and transparent elections. Something maybe you forgot in Europe, the achievements. In Europe, you have the problem that there are not enough people coming to the elections. I'm sure tomorrow in Tunisia, you will see a very, very high turnout. because that's something that people fought for, and that election tomorrow is a big success story for them.
One last question. What's the role of social platforms during those revolutions?
Well, I think they played a very, very important role at the beginning. For me, the whole thing didn't start like last spring. We had an issue in Egypt last summer 2010, when we had a case where a young Egyptian man named Khalid Said was beaten to death on the street by two policemen in plainclothes policemen. And this kind of things, normally, they would have just appeared in some human rights report and a few dozen people would have read it. But in this case, the family did something really important. They put the picture of this young man who was called Khalid Said, 26-year-old, his old picture, and a picture they took in the morgue, where you can barely recognize him because they've beaten him up so much. And they put these two pictures beside each other and put it into the internet. And that created a huge story in Egypt. We had a Facebook page that was called "We Are All Khalid Said," and hundreds, thousands of clicks. And the discussion we had in Egypt at that time was like, okay, how do you translate this "I like" from Facebook, for example, onto, you cannot get rid of a regime by "I like" on Facebook. You basically need to do this on the street. And the discussion was like, how do we do this? How do we translate this big power, virtual power on the internet onto the street? And while we're still discussing this in Egypt, the Tunisians were the first ones basically showing how to do it. And then the first evening when the Tunisian dictator Ben Ali flew out, escaped, the Egyptian youth was standing in front of the Tunisian embassy and said, "Mubarak, the airplane is also waiting for you." And then, of course, it was obvious that this kind of social media revolution is going to come to Egypt. But I think in many ways, the effect of social media is maybe a little bit exaggerated. Because at the end, I think what really mobilized people was television. And if I may have the time just to tell one story to tell you the power of television. There was a TV show, a talk show in Egypt, in one private television station. A TV talk show that is seen by millions in Egypt. It was probably the most popular show. In the middle of the uprising in Egypt, there was a doctor who showed up in one of these programs. His name was Tarek Helmi. And he, in this talk show, told his own story. He said, I'm a doctor, I'm really not interested in politics, I never cared about politics, about Mubarak. My life was between home and the hospital. And then on the 25th of January, when the Egyptian revolution started, his daughter, they were sitting together, and his daughter said to him, "Dad, I have to go to Tahrir Square because all my friends are there, I will go there." And they were discussing it, and they're trying to convince her not to go, also her brother. But she was stubborn. She went to go to Tahrir Square, and she never came back, she stayed there. And then a few days later, his son called him and said, "Dad," the same son who tried to convince his sister before not to go, he said, "Dad, I have to go to Tahrir Square because some of my best friends are injured there, and I want to see what happened to them." So he left too. Then a few days later, he got a phone call from his daughter from the square. She said, "Dad, we need doctors here. We have so many injured people. Please come and help us." And he put together a small team and went to Tahrir Square and also stayed there. So the whole family was at Tahrir Square. And then all this, he's telling the story in this talk show. And then he's telling the story how he received a 13-year-old boy who was beaten up by the gangs of Mubarak, and he had like a big wound over his head, and he stitched him up. And then the little boy said, when he wanted to kind of finish his job, the little boy said, "No, I don't have time. I have to defend our square," he said. And then he left. And then comes this moment of really Egyptian TV history, where this doctor basically breaks down in this talk show and cannot continue to talk. Tears are over his cheeks. They're trying to calm him down, and then he continues his story. He says, "And I saw this 13-year-old boy another time, one more time. They brought him to me again a few hours later, and he was shot in his head, and he was dead. This program was seen by millions of people. It was on a Monday. Normally, for Tahrir Square, they mobilized for Fridays because it was easy with the Friday prayer. The following day of Monday, the Tuesday, there was more than 1 million people on Tahrir Square. And one of the reasons why this happened was this particular talk show in the private Egyptian television station. So I think this is an important story that not only shows you how a whole family gets sucked in onto the Tahrir Square, originally being completely apolitical, but it also shows you the power of television at that time.
Thank you, Karim. I hope, I wish we had a couple of more hours left to listen to you, but that was very inspiring, very interesting. Please give it up to Karim. I hope you heard that and how long and that took.
Thank you very much.
I wish you all the best at your workplace, all the best to Tunisia.
Very exciting. Tomorrow the elections, we should all see what the elections and what's the outcome. It's going to show us where the Arab world is going to turn in the next years, I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay.